All right. And we're going live. Thank you for joining us for another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Ben Wheeler. Prank, air horn, prank, prank. And I'm joined by Anthony Marquetta, uh, who I've only prepared a slow clap for. I'm sorry. Uh, Today we're. Sorry, what?
That's okay. I forgive you.
Thank you, thank you. Today we're talking about Columbus, an interesting figure of history, and sort of the ideas that come down from him. There's a lot of information that can be, um, how do I want to put it? There's just a lot of information that's out there that a lot of people aren't really informed on, or even that people talk to him in any sort of balanced way anymore. So check out Pinkerton's Ghost if you hadn't yet. It's dancing across the stage, dancy, dancy. Uh, so yeah, Anthony, you know a bit more about his life than I do. Why don't you let us know about
Little bit.
a little bit?
I don't consider myself an expert. I was in high school. I was part of the Columbian Squires. If you know the Knights of Columbus today, they're a Catholic men's organization. The butt of many jokes, but actually they do a lot of good work. I have nothing but respect for them. I was part of their youth branch. I have not, at least as of now, ended up joining their adult branch, so I'm not a Knight of Columbus myself. But I was part of the high school equivalent of them, the Columbian Squires. So they have they believe in a sort of hagiography, I guess is the right word, of Columbus, where he was like this heroic saintly figure who was the model and how we should act and do things, and that is how they present him to the world and to other members of to other members of the Knights, that he's like who we're supposed to emulate. Of course, their version of Christopher Columbus and the historical Christopher Columbus do not match in all particulars, so they are not entirely different either. Uh, Christopher Columbus is an extremely interesting and very complicated person. A very complicated person. More
Amazing.
complicated. Yeah, more complicated than he is given credit for. He is either demonized or lionized equally by either side. Honestly, it's a little bit like Robert E. Lee in that respect, who
Mm-hmm.
is a similarly controversial figure where you're either going to be putting up statues or you're going to be condemning him as this horrible monster, where the truth is a lot more nuanced than that. Much like Robert E. Lee, though, and also I think a little bit differently from Robert E. Lee, I feel that Christopher Columbus does not get enough credit nowadays. I mean, he used to, but for how much of a genius he was. Robert E. Lee, at the very least, you could say whatever you want about the man, but I don't think there is anybody on either side of the Civil War debate or position who will deny that he was an absolutely brilliant general who won many battles at greatly outnumbered and prolonged the war long past the date that an even average general would have seen it end. He made mistakes, but he was a genius. Christopher Columbus, I think, is similar. However, because of the modern, trying to think of the word, the smear, I guess smear campaign is accurate. The modern smear campaign against Columbus, they not only need to smear the fact that, Columbus's character, which is at least worth talking about to an extent, they need to smear Columbus's legacy and reputation, and that is something I think, much like Robert E. Lee, is shouldn't be a lot less impeachable. Columbus was one of the most influential human beings in the history of the world, and he did it by being the most brilliant navigator of his generation. So, I know that the whole joke, he ended up in what is now known as the West Indies because he thought it was Asia, because he was so wrong about navigating the world. But in actuality, what that really means is that Columbus was the only man brave enough and brilliant enough to navigate all the way to the Americas in that time. Yes, the Norse did it, but the Norse also had almost no the Norse brief Norse colonization of North America that did not last had almost no effect on wider world history and was only even confirmed to be historical relatively recently,
Yep.
like sometime in the 1900s they were able to confirm that it was actually historical. It did not have any effect on the wider world at all. uh, don't get me wrong, it was an extraordinary maritime feat, and it should be celebrated for that reason alone. But what Columbus did had far, far, far more impact on the world than what Leif Erikson did,
Oh yeah.
and
And
deserves to be remembered as such.
yep. And there's a lot that goes on with like recently I've been uncovering some information about like Welsh travelers and the blue-eyed Indians and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is just kind of like, well, you're absolutely right. The Welsh might have done it. The Vikings did it. Whoever, there was civilizations that preceded the Indians, but in the end, there was only the red man there and his many, many tribes. So it's like even if somebody did it, like even if the Romans did it, it's still not as impressive as if as what Columbus did, which created a lasting colony.
Yes. So the fascinating thing about Columbus's character is that if you were to look for an overwhelming motivation for what he did, something that's consistent from the beginning of his journeys to the end of his life, it would be one thing, and that would be conversion to Christianity. Columbus was an evangelist. In fact, he was extraordinary. And by the way, the Catholic Church has written several different documents, which Edward Fesser has documented, supporting the mission of Columbus to convert the world to Christianity. Uh, that was the number one driving motivation of Columbus. Now, with that said, as many people will point out, and correctly, there were times where it seemed as if his desire for money or gold or land overrode his desire for evangelization. However, it is undeniable to say that when he started his voyages, that is what he was supporting. So, here is the interesting thing about Columbus and why I say he's a very complex person. First off, we need to talk about the position of Christianity towards the chattel slave trade. Right? I specifically specify the chattel slave trade to designate a slave trade where the slaves are designated as property less than human,
Mm-hmm.
which is inherently immoral, as opposed to a sort of indentured servitude thing, like the sort of thing that we see in the Bible when they mention slavery. That is more similar to how we would think of it. If your version of slavery sees the slaves as property, as less than human beings, it is inherently immoral. So that's something to get out of the way. One thing that's interesting about this is that from the earliest period of time when we started seeing, natives from other lands, the position of Christianity, which at the time, because the of expeditions overseas were primarily done by Catholics, the English joined in afterward, but it was the Spanish first. And the
Portuguese.
position, yeah, and the Portuguese. You're right. I'm sorry, not Spanish, Portuguese. Uh, they will kill me if they hear me make that mistake. The Portuguese and the Spanish don't like each other. Uh, so the point I'm making is the earliest that we have to hear about it was an immediate and strong condemnation of chattel slavery. That was the first thing. That was loud. It's fine. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. As soon as the concept of chattel slavery was brought up to Christian lands, the first thing that we did was condemn it. Say that is immoral, it is wrong, don't do it. Now, that position among the monarchy specifically, actually not among the Vatican. The Vatican has always been fairly consistent in the condemnation of chattel slavery. Uh, I can't speak for the Anglican Church, which was the first Protestant organization to really do this, and I literally can't speak. I don't know what they had to say about it, but
They so it was one of those things where like because the Protestant church is more fractious than the Catholic church, there's no even with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king as pope, there isn't a lot that they can like universally do as well. But
that's fair.
a lot of the first true abolitionists, as in people who said it is immoral and were banning it from the empire itself, came from Protestant England. William Wilberforce
Yeah,
is the big one.
I was about to say famously William Wilberforce, right?
Yep, yep. And so
Which
it's.
is
Hmm?
absolutely true.
Oh, yeah. So it's like one of those things where, like, whatever people may say in the history books and all that jazz, in the end, it was only Christian organizations that created true abolition of slavery. And, it's still heard of in many parts of the world. But at least, we can put that feather on our cap, you see. And it will be cold comfort among the ruins. Uh, but that's me. I've got some stuff I want to talk about after this because I have some interesting ideas.
Yeah,
But
I'll go through it quickly because do think it's important to talk about what exactly happened here. So, like, the Spanish Empire obviously did get heavily involved in the slave trade and how, what happened, right?
mm-hmm.
Because it is a fact historically documented that the earliest talk of the slave trade among the empires was condemnation from the highest echelons, including consistent condemnation from the Vatican, which Columbus purportedly served. So, what happened? What changed? Well, this is the fascinating part of the story. I believe it was the Taino people. That was the first place that he landed. He met a group of people called the Taino people, and they heard rumors of things like cannibals there. But they never actually met them, and it seemed like rumors, like, oh, they're cannibal natives, but, don't worry about them, right? And Columbus is just like, I don't know, I never met them.
Uh-huh.
So he left some men behind, went back to Spain or to Portugal, right? Was it?
Right.
I want to say Spain, but I thought it was Spain.
No, he went back and forth a couple times.
Either way, when he went back a hero, was widely praised by all and sundry, and he went back again to that same island, right? Where he had left his men, and something happened that changed Columbus. He went, and his men were not there. This was very curious. Why were his men not there? Did they die from disease? I mean, that's certainly possible, right?
Right.
That finished off uh, over half of the Jamestown settlement and over half of the Plymouth settlement, so
And
seems
fabled
plausible.
Roanoke.
Well, Roanoke actually probably had something to do with the natives, since the only warning we get is the name Croatoan, but which is why I didn't bring up Roanoke. But the point is that seems plausible, right? So
Right.
what do you do to figure this out? Well, you ask the Taino people about it, right?
Right.
Those men who you left there. Hey, what happened to my men? Where are they? Why aren't they here? Oh, don't worry about it. No, no. We're gonna worry about this. So he brings some men inland and he discovers the cannibals among the Taino people. His men had been killed and eaten by the actual cannibals who were among the natives.
Actual cannibal Shia
Columbus.
LaBeouf.
Yeah, exactly. Horrendously. This is all real and does not get enough attention. Columbus was originally talks extremely positively of the native people. He almost has like a noble savage thing going on. Then he comes back and realizes that his men have actually been eaten, and this changes Columbus. He
As one
becomes
does.
yes, he becomes much more jaded, much more jaded. Suddenly, he doesn't really seem to care that much about the slave trade. And the most horrible thing that we know Columbus to have done, I forget the name of the tribe, but a peaceful people, who we know to have been peaceful, by the way, these are actually peaceful people, were introduced to Columbus's men, and he noticed the gold that they had on them and the jewels. So he callously orders them all enslaved and sold. He is actually censured by the queen for this.
Really?
Like, this is considered, yeah, oh yeah, this is considered so terrible what he did, the imprisonment and the sale of these peaceful people, that the queen is forced to actually censure him. He eventually, they kind of just live and let live and let him go because he's Columbus and he's making them, more money than they've ever seen before.
Yep. It
But
certainly won't cause them inflation 100 years down the line. No, no.
they'll be long dead by then. Point is, so it seems like what has happened was this: Columbus goes on this grand religious to spread Christianity to all the world, right?
Right.
And this is his birthright. He sees himself as chosen by God. And to be honest, if you look at the records of his life, it seems pretty plausible that he actually was. Nor does it, and actually hearing about the terrible things he did do later in life, it still seems pretty plausible to me. Just read any account of the Old Testament. Nobody
Mm-hmm.
said that you needed to be a good person to be chosen by God. Uh,
Yep.
King David and King Solomon would like a word with you on that front, both of whom did amazing things, but also terrible things. So Christopher Columbus is right at home among the Old Testament, patriarchs and kings and chosen people.
One of
So
the things I'll point out with King David actually is that some of his last words were him telling Solomon, his son, to go and kill his enemies, who David couldn't kill because of promises made or anything like that. So it's like, I'm not even counting like his past stuff. Like one of his last acts on Earth was to tell his son to make sure that his enemies don't go to the grave with gray hairs.
yeah,
It's
there's a whole thing that you could talk about with Solomon and what the wisdom of Solomon even was. There was an interesting article I read by a writer named James Chastek. I believe he's just like a Catholic theologian, but he wrote an article on Solomon where he theorized that what we see as the famous chapter where Solomon can ask for one gift and he asks for wisdom, and God grants him more wisdom than any human who ever lived, as a reward for giving the right answer, kind of. Like, we could see that almost as like God is sort of mocking him. You have
mm-hmm.
more wisdom than all humans who have ever lived, but humans are not particularly wise. So this is what you get. You're still not that wise. And on one hand, I'm not sure if that's just a modern reinterpretation, like, it's us modernists looking back on it and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you'll find any accounts at the time of people saying, oh, yeah, Solomon should have just said God or something. No, they say Solomon made the right choice.
Yep.
And also, Holy Wisdom is one of the titles of God. The Church of Hagia Sophia and things like that. So there is something to that as well. However, I do think there is something to what he's saying. That Solomon asks for wisdom and is granted more wisdom than any human who has ever lived, but the human capacity for wisdom is inherently limited. So that ultimately makes him, like the smartest monkey, which I sort of get.
Right.
Um,
I
and it
find it
does come
very.
across too, like King Solomon is the wisest man who ever lived, but he also had a harem and made many mistakes that, in retrospect, reading that section of the Bible looked to us to be incredibly obvious. Like, how could
Yeah.
you do these things? They're clearly against the will of God. Aren't you the wisest man to ever live? And the answer is yes, which means, how unwise are all of us is the question that you need to ask in response. But
Yep.
whatever, this is now off topic. I'm just going off of about Christopher Columbus. So I do think that he probably was chosen by God for this mission. I find that plausible just by the sheer number of coincidences and near-death experiences that he had, and also the fact that he was very, very open about his initial view of his goal of wanting to convert the world, but that realizing that those natives that he was trying to convert were actually far more savage than he ever could have dreamed of them being, that he ever had in his wildest notions ever thought they could possibly be, broke something in him. and he became a much more callous man. He no longer saw the natives as the noble savages. He no longer really even saw them as people. At
Mm.
least not all the time. Every now and then, you see this sort of push and pull in Columbus, where he will sometimes talk about the natives as, these poor people who he needs to help, and sometimes he will speak of them as the property that he needs to handle and that he's going to trade. And I think that's because he's still feeling this push and pull between, I need to bring the gospel to all men, but are these people even men? They ate my people, you know.
Yep.
And then you see he's doing it to people who really had nothing to do with it, and I think that's because he's just at that point, I don't even know if these people count anymore, and they could make me a lot of money, so I might as well do it.
Yep.
Uh, he's a fascinating person and a sad one, I think, more than anything else. I think that Columbus is really a tragic story in more than it was a triumphant one, or sad, or I'm trying to think of the word, or a dark one. It's more of a tragic story.
Right.
Uh, he dies, and his legacy immediately after death and for many centuries afterward is one of a hero. Then there's this reinterpretation, and the reinterpretation of Columbus isn't entirely undeserved, but it's not entirely deserved either.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, a lot of it, much like with people who are tearing down the Robert E. statues, uh, a lot of the statue tearing down. I'm trying to think of the word for it, but I can't really. A lot of the tearing down of the statues isn't motivated by actual historical accuracy or a desire for truth, but by activists who just hate Western civilization and are looking for any stick to beat a dog. So the proper response to anybody who really wants to tear down the statue of Columbus is, no, go to hell.
Yep.
Because these are not people who are there to have a conversation about the legacy of Columbus. They're people who want to destroy Western civilization.
Yep. One of the things with Columbus and all these other guys, it always strikes me how strange it is that they came from essentially retaking Spain from the Muslims. Almost an almost 1,000 year struggle, and like 14. I think the siege of Granada ended in 1492 too. Let's
Oh,
see
really?
here. Yeah, the
Let's see.
Granada War, 1491. So in other words, like it.
Wow.
Yep. So in other words, like these guys are coming off of like this civilizational triumph to another civilizational triumph that honestly probably overshadowed um, this amazing achievement of taking over what was the true Christian lands once again. It's it's inspiring in a way because these men, you know, these mercenaries, these adventurers, explorers know that they can get great wealth if they stick to it. Later on, once I find the quotation, I'm reading Ryan Laundrie's Madness Amongst Masculinity, and I'm reading also. I also read Bronze Age Mindset finally, uh, and there's a great quote about how we only decided this a couple minutes ago, so I'm still a little bit out of there. But it's like the idea of how the manor bund works, how the friend group works. These savage men. Columbus came back, um, and basically, comes back to find these people who he's worked with, for years. He's worked with them. He crossed the sea that no one in living memory had crossed. He he did all these things, and then it's like he comes back after what was probably a year or 2 years or something, um, and discovers that these men who who absolutely were like brothers to him, even if it's like they're rebellious soldiers or sailors or whatever, they're dead. They're dead and they can't come back, um, or anything like that. And these savages killed them. Here's a quote. A Marxist historian will tell you that the earliest Spanish settlers of Argentina were a rigid hierarchy that had a class stratification engaged in evil interclass oppression, etc., etc. The historian will somehow lay all of the contemporary problems of Argentina on this initial outpost. Hidden in the analysis is the truth that the mission was barely over 100 men. This was a Mannerbund, as in a group of men gathering together for a single purpose, formed by well, no, for like friendships and stuff like that. I shouldn't limit it like that. Formed by a long sail across the ocean and the imposing challenges of settling an alien land. The men who signed up all shared the adventurous spirit, but had specialized skills and variety of talents. A true leader, a captain, would determine who did what, blah blah, different jobs. Those outlaws were men who betrayed the Mannerbund and shirked their end of the contract between brothers. So he goes on to talk about, basically not having outgroups control everything. Uh, and then he ends it with the strength of a Mannerbund depends on a shared experience and struggle. Uh, Men who join for a weekend of fun pale to men spending years together as a team, or men forming a community in hostile or new territory. So it's the like I didn't know that really about his men because I'm not a great student of Columbus or Spanish history or anything like that. Uh, and it's how do I want to put it? The It's a very inspiring thing because Columbus paved the way for men like Cortez and Pizarro and stuff like that, and who were hard, adventurous men who were surrounded by other men who were also hard and adventurous. They were probably soldiers who came out of the Grenada War, wanting more money, more adventure, more profit. Or maybe they're the sons of the men who took lands back from the Muslims. Like, there's a whole lot of history there that just kind of gets compressed into this idea that 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it's one of those things where I like look into it, I read it a bit. I've got some old manuscripts around here somewhere. I've got all kinds of stuff, and it's just kind of inspiring. These men came out of the fire, tried and true, and they conquered empires with barely a handful of men and some native allies who, whatever the Aztecs were doing, if it was advantageous for them, they would have turned on the Spanish in an instant. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. And I like reading about it. I like hearing about it.
Yeah, the conquistadors are a whole other thing with again another very complicated history. Uh, Hernan Cortez is an interesting character in his own right and a completely different person from Christopher Columbus, by the way. Uh, I think that Hernan Cortez, believe it or not, is actually less morally complicated than Christopher Columbus is.
Really?
If I had to say so, yes.
Hmm.
So, my read of Cortez is that he did what he did more or less with the backing of the other, and this is just my own, I could be missing large portions of what happened there in Mexico, which I'm not a student of particularly. But my read of Cortez is that he essentially did what he did with the more or less constant backing of the who all absolutely despise the Aztec for very obvious reasons.
As one should.
Yes, for As John C. Wright, I believe, would put it, for reasons that should be too obvious to mention.
Yep.
With that said, Hernan Cortez was also by gold than Columbus seemed to be early on, though Columbus was certainly motivated by gold by the end of his life, at least. And Hernan Cortez seemed to always pretty much just, he was there for the money.
Money!
There's another difference with Hernan Cortez in that Columbus had biographers, including his son and many, many people who talked about him and knew him, whereas Hernan Cortez actually does not have a lot of writing about him and very little writing from him, so we don't really know all that much about his motives. On the other hand, what we do know is that taking over the Aztecs was a very popular
move. It reminds me of that one joke, life began on X, which everyone considers an unpopular move. There's also a version of that meme where it's a guy going back in time to kick a fish back into the Devonian Sea. Because, something land legs ruined everything by evolving it.
No, I'm confused. I don't get it.
No, the joke is that coming out of the sea was an unpopular move.
Oh. Now I get it. Now that you've explained the joke, it's much funnier.
Thank you. I appreciate your... Either way, hi Bradford, we do see you. Sort of going out from it, like talking about his influence, because we've only barely touched on, like, what he did. He was governor for a bit, viceroy, I think, at times. He led people, he built cities, European cities anyway. He took care of a lot of business, and he made sure that his stuff lasted beyond his life, even though other people, from what I remember, tried to take it from him, whether rightly or not rightly. I'm not, judging him for anything about it. But it's like, thinking about it, like, the image I have up is, one of the Vaporwave, tracks, and it says Manifest Destiny, with somebody who I think is Christopher Columbus holding a globe. Oh my goodness. I took a chip earlier and I shouldn't have. Holding a globe with a purple sort of VHS distorted background and yellow sun behind him, which I think is one of the better ones. Even though Manifest Destiny wasn't a thing back then, it goes back to us talking about the frontier and Trumpton and Branson, as we're calling it earlier, as well as a few other things here and there. It was a spirit of these guys that really pushed them, beyond the limits of the civilization that they were in. If Spain hadn't gone, to the west, people still probably would have gone. People still would have wanted those sweet spices and all that jazz. But maybe they would go down into Morocco, or maybe they just would stay in Spain. But then what would you do with all these young men, these fiery, passionate young men who need purpose in their life, who need a great work to do? How old was Columbus when he went across the sea?
Let's see. First voyage was 1492 when he was born in 1451.
So he was
41 years old.
Right, 41 years old. That's
older than I thought, actually.
Yeah, same here. But at the same time, it feels right. You know what I mean? Like, that's about the right time that he could, have lived a life worthy of respect or anything like that. He could have, earned his fortune or whatever. But also, like, gained the backing to really take care of it. I don't know, it feels right. Because here's something that's been kind of bothering me, if I can talk about it, is that when Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar comes across a statue of Alexander, and I've talked about this before. He comes across a statue of Alexander, and he goes, you know, what have I done that compares to you? And I can't remember the story exactly because my memory's just very bad. But he basically looked up at Alexander the Great, who at the same age that Julius Caesar was, he was conquering the known world. He was conquering everything he could lay his hands on. He was only stopped because his men were like, I can't do this anymore, dude. Please, we're hitting the edge of the world. We want to go home. That's what it stopped. And even then, he went back to Babylon and was planning his next great series of conquests. And Julius Caesar felt like this cuck, this beta, this little dude, looking up at a giant.
Julius Caesar is an interesting person because Julius Caesar honestly was a man who was too good for Rome.
He was.
Whereas, yeah, Alexander the Great, on the other hand, was a man who was just right for Greece.
That's a great way to put it. But it's like looking up at like guys like Columbus and Julius Caesar and these guys. Not that I'm anywhere near as good as anything that they could do. It's like it has a great deal of inspiration for me because it's not that these guys, it's not that Julius Caesar was looking up to Alexander and going, I can't do that. It was, man, I got work to do. Let's do it. Let's get it. Let's cross this Rubicon, baby. No, I don't think Julius Caesar ever talked like that. Though I have read some Roman debates, and they are, when they break down, they're actually quite entertaining because Greeks will like get really sly or do some sort of rhyming poem to claim that the my opponent is a cuck or whatever. But then the Romans will just go blow it out your ass, and the debate ends probably with someone being murdered or banished.
The formation of the Roman Empire is an interesting thing, and I have talked to people, and I tend to agree with this take on it, that the Roman Empire was not notably worse than the Roman Republic. In fact, in many ways, it was probably better. Less brutal, less corrupt, the early Roman Empire. So, people wonder, like, the greatness of Augustus Caesar. How great was he exactly? And I think the answer is that he deserved the reputation that he had at the time. So, it's worth asking, how did Augustus Caesar accomplish what Julius Caesar tried and failed to do? And the answer is that Augustus Caesar was much more careful and much more practical about it. Augustus Caesar did not take over the Roman Empire. Augustus Caesar was given the Roman Empire. He convinced everybody that he was the man who should be in charge. And the people he could not convince, he only fought when he knew he could win.
Yep. Because he fought Mark Antony on occasion. Like, not that much happened, but like even before Actium and all those other big names, they had minor skirmishes with each other before Brutus and Cassius got their due for being traitors to Rome and Caesar. But
I mean, he was quite, he was a careful man. He got the revenge that he sought, but he got it with patience.
Yep.
Julius Caesar reminds me a lot of Hannibal. So Hannibal of Carthage, of course, was a man who was born to people who did not deserve him. He was a genuinely great man, a true genius, beloved by his men and his people, and he was driven out of Carthage on a rail. So why? Well, one way that we can establish the reputation of Hannibal is to point out that he led an army of mostly mercenaries overseas for 15 years in a protracted war that he did not win, and we do not have one single recording of any sort of mutiny or uprising in his army. And the reason we don't have a recording of this is because, of course, it did not happen, But the reason it did not happen is that Hannibal would never ask his army to do something that he would not do himself.
Yep.
The mark of a truly great leader. The other amazing thing about Hannibal is that after Carthage lost, he managed to negotiate with Rome's own genius, Marcus Scipio, the genius who finally defeated him.
Mm-hmm.
He manages to negotiate with him. First off, he somehow stays out of jail, which was an extraordinarily unpopular decision. If Marcus Scipio was not also the man who had defeated Hannibal, it's quite possible he would have been executed for leaving Hannibal alive.
Yep.
And Scipio himself complains to the end of his life that he never thought he got the credit he deserved, probably because of the decision that he made to leave Hannibal alive. And Hannibal decides to become a politician in Carthage, and Hannibal discovers something very curious about Carthage. He realizes, hey, wait a minute, so the Romans decide not to destroy the city, something that Cicero is very upset about, by the way.
Cicero is very upset. I like it.
Yes. He famously ends all of his speeches from then on with, and also Carthage must be destroyed. Any speech he makes in front of the Roman Senate, he ends with, and all Carthage must be destroyed. So Cicero is very upset about this, but Carthage is left standing, even though they no longer have an army or anything like that, and they owe exorbitant taxes. But Hannibal notices something. After he becomes a politician, is elected to leadership in the city, he says, hey, wait a minute. We should have enough money to pay these taxes. I've just gone over the banks, and we definitely have enough money to pay these taxes without raising taxes on the people. What gives? Why are we charging our people these taxes? And he figures out that the reason for Carthage's dire financial straits are that all of the noble families in Carthage have been embezzling from the Carthaginian National Bank. And he puts a stop to this, which makes him incredibly popular among the people and incredibly unpopular among all of the most powerful families in Carthage. The result of this is that he cannot be killed, because if he is killed, it would probably spark some sort of uprising because of how popular he is. But he certainly can't be left there to do what he's doing, so he's driven out of the city and is forced to flee. And Hannibal basically spends the rest of his life as a general here for any army that happens to be fighting Rome at the time. So if you're looking for, by the way, how did the Roman Empire grow so exponentially post-Punic Wars? It's because Hannibal died. He was hiring himself out to these enemies, and never again did he defeat the Romans in battle. But he probably prolonged those wars much longer than they would have otherwise. And he also has some absolutely killer quotes from this era. There's a famous quote when I think he was hired by the Seleucids. I might be wrong about which specific group it was. But the Seleucids king shows Hannibal his massive 50,000-man strong army, very proud of it, and asks Hannibal, so what do you think? Is this enough for Rome? And Hannibal says something, and I'm going to paraphrase him here because he says it in much fruitier language because this is the ancient times and that's how they speak. But Hannibal responds with something along the lines of, well, the Romans are greedy people, so it takes a lot to satisfy them. But yes, I think they will be satisfied with this 50,000-man army. In other words, yeah, no, you're going to lose, which he does, by the way. Eventually, there is a famous meeting. Marcus Scipio actually meets with Hannibal in peacetime when he goes to meet with the foreign king that Hannibal has now hired himself out to as an advisor. Marcus Scipio actually meets Hannibal.
Right.
And they shake hands and they have a famous meeting. And Marcus Scipio, looking to be flattered by Hannibal, says, who would you name the greatest general of all time? And he says, without hesitation, Alexander the Great. And Scipio thinks about it, goes, okay, that's fair. that's a good answer. He goes, but who would you put as number 2? And he's waiting to hear his name. And Hannibal goes, oh, number 2. I'm trying to remember who it was, but a Greek king, Fabius Maximus or something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But, he named some Greek king who has been fighting against the Romans for years. In fact, there is a term for the style of warfare that he invented that was still used nowadays, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Some sort of long, protracted war.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at it.
And
Because...
I can't remember the name of the king, but it doesn't matter. And Scipio now is a little bit disconcerted. So who would you put at number 3? And Hannibal answers, myself. He goes, because of my boldness early in my career, I won victories that I don't think many other people could have won. And Scipio, realizing that he's kind of been played now, because he was expecting to hear his name at some point, bursts out laughing, and then says, where would you be if I had not beaten you? And Hannibal says, if you had not beaten me, I would be above Alexander.
Right. Pyrrhus of Epirus. Sorry.
What was that?
Pyrrhus of Epirus is the second guy.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. By the way, the phrase is Pyrrhic victory.
There we go.
So, yes, Pyrrhus. Anyway. So, he says, if you had not beaten me, I would be above Alexander, and the two part on good terms. I think even, he offers to let Marcus Scipio, bed in his rooms, and he turns him down because Rome is about to go to war with the king that Hannibal is, hired out to right now. So, he can't, stay with the guy who's been hired by him.
Yeah.
But it's still an amazing story. The fact that meeting even happened is one of those great coincidences. And, of course, Hannibal dies the noble pagan's death of masculine suicide. Obviously, we as Christians know that suicide is a sin, but among the pagans of the time, this was what the true men did when faced with absolute defeat and shame.
There's a lot of stories about that. There's a one with Themosthenes, who defeated the Persians in the famous Battle of Salamis. Did that when the Persian king was like, okay, so you're going to teach me strategies against the Greeks, right? And he's like, yeah, absolutely, give me a year. And then once the war was declared, killed himself rather than betray his countrymen.
Yeah, I mean, to the pagans at the time, it wasn't trying to think of the word, the noble thing to do. Hannibal was going to be killed, probably tortured by the Romans. So suicide was an absolutely logical move. To be fair, too, we don't actually know for sure if it's suicide, but we suspect.
We suspect.
It seems likely. A tragic death for a man who was far too good for his very brutal people. Always emphasize in the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome, there really was there was no good guy or bad guy, as in most ancient wars.
Right.
There was no side that you could look at in the Punic Wars and say, this side were the good guys. Rome were the aggressors, but the Carthaginians had infant sacrifice, so,
Yep.
Whose side are you on? Not that the Romans were any picnic themselves. They even didn't really seem to have that much of a problem with the infant sacrifice, so much as they were just they thought it was really weird.
Right.
It's not... They didn't so much as, think that the, infant sacrifice was immoral, so much as they thought that the Phoenicians were very weird, or the Carthaginians were very weird for doing it. And those weirdos sacrifice infant freaks.
Freaks.
Not like the Christian horror upon sacrifices, where they immediately said, "Holy crap! These people are monsters." It was more like the Romans said, "Wow, these people are weirdos."
Right.
I mean, the Romans would certainly, it's like, why would you think that sacrificing infants would work? That's not a good offering to the gods. Why would the gods care about babies? They're babies.
Yeah,
It
it's
just goes to show those Carthaginians just don't know
don't know.
what they're talking about.
They don't know what Zeus wants. No Sky Daddy getting the good stuff. Yeah. Taking this back to Columbus. Uh, and well, this is something interesting, I guess. Like these men who did these things, I assume that Hannibal and Scipio were very old at that time. Assuming the story that they met is true, it like a whole life fighting each other and pitting your civilizations against each other, which had already fought for quite some time before. And even if Rome was the aggressors, Carthage was trying to get back on some things, and it's they weren't willing to pay their taxes, the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The spirit in them, like 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 Hannibal was kicked out of his own people. He lost wars. He had all these different things that he had to do and overcome, and some he did, some he didn't, as with all men. And it's what? Uh, it's just very interesting to me. Like it's like they must have had a fire in them that was worth respecting. Like Julius Caesar had a fire in him. Augustus had a fire in him, even if it was a slow burn. You had Pompey's kids. You had Pompey himself, who went crazy sometimes, or supposedly, because they called him the little butcher. You have people like Columbus. You have people like Cortez. Pizarro, who all three were very different men. Uh, and besides that, even like their own soldiers who also were willing to dive into jungles for the promise of gold, and for every one that succeeded, there must have been 5 or even 10 that died horribly, or at best just got some land. Um, I know there were several expeditions that just straight up disappeared from the earth, probably eaten by the Sioux or something like that, because they started traveling up north that way. And it's just something to think about, like how when we look up to these guys and we see what they've done, you know, how to compare against them. Like, being a guy who's N, Gen Y, and stuff like that. There's this weird prevailing sadness. Our generation was the last generation. The 79 to 89 cohort was the last generation to really grow up in America. And I was pretty isolated, but even I still got a taste of it. Um, and it's like how to how to take it up. Like the people I talk to about this sort of how do I want to put it? This sort of like spirit that the generation has. Our goal is to, at least in our circles, is to preserve it so that the generations after us still have a bit of the fire left that they can rekindle. But it's not necessarily us. Like when I talk to Zoomers who have their stuff together, and even younger men from Generation Alpha, uh, they tend to have this weird like energy to them. Like they're gonna do it. Even millennials who aren't corrupt have this strange energy to them that I absolutely adore. Because it's like, yeah, of course we're gonna do this and this and this and this. I'm like, wow, look at it. You know, it's the spirit. Like even though there were all these issues in Rome and going back and forth, and in Spain, Columbus and Hannibal and Scipio and all these other things were men of their times. Like, you don't get men like Scipio in Sulla's dictatorship, republic, or whatever you want to call it, the prescriptions, and you don't get men like Scipio, during, 200, 300 years beforehand. It's like, the same with Hannibal. Of course, we don't know as much about Carthaginian history and the famous people and their doings, but like, it was a nation of merchants, and he was the alpha Chad among them. It's it's interesting. It's interesting because it's like I'm trying to think of these uh, these people and how one could pull from their life. Like right now, I'm listening to Plutarch's Parallel Lives of Greeks and Romans. It's 80 hours long, and it's just these people like going from disaster to disaster, pulling themselves out of it. Columbus moving from weird stuff to whatever, uh, to profit, rulership, or maybe it's taken away from him for a season, or maybe he gets sick and dies, or maybe he survives the sickness like Augustus did, because he got sick several times during his reign. I think about that stuff a lot. Hmm. How can we
I mean, in terms of,
Mhm.
go ahead.
Like how can we take these ideas, for ourselves and grow them into something, that's really worth, like reading about, talking about, having more to it than just, oh, we were here, we lived lives that may or may not have been good, and then we died.
I mean, in terms of, the greatness of our own culture, I suppose is the way to put it. Uh, I remember reading an article that was dated from the Civil War that was, "Why does America not have great presidents anymore?" And the article, again, I forget who wrote it, and it was dated from the Civil War. Probably somebody you wouldn't even have heard of, just like an academic from the time. But it was a fascinating article that seemed to be useful now. And they said basically that American culture was built in such a way, and the American government was built in such a way that we did not need great men as presidents. They also said that the last great man that we really could say that we had as a president was Ulysses S. Grant. And he pointed out Grant not as an example of a great president, not a president who did a great job, as a man who was larger than the position itself, if that makes sense. He was a war
Yes.
hero. Now, did we have great men as presidents post World War II? Well, we did have Eisenhower. Though I've never, to be honest with you, I've never really heard Eisenhower talked about in that way. In fact, I've always heard him talked about generally as a pretty mediocre president, more like as just a guy who was there.
I think he
I
was had a little
recall,
bit more than that, but I can see what you're
I
saying.
recall my grandfather's criticism was that Eisenhower played too much golf, but he wasn't particularly political.
I
My
mean,
grandfather, I mean.
when you win World War II.
Eisenhower is an interesting case, though, because I never really hear about in that way. But Grant is talked about in that way. I mean, people like Grant and Washington are honestly, in some ways, remembered more for their victories on the battlefield than for their time as politicians, right?
Yep.
Whereas Eisenhower, when you hear his name, you think of him almost more as that guy who was the president in the 50s.
Well,
It's a
he
little strange.
I suppose. I always thought well of him. He didn't ruin anything more than any other president has ever ruined anything. Uh, so feels better than some things out there. But I guess I don't know enough myself. It's I've seen his president. I think I've seen his presidential library. And it was nice. It had everything in it. Uh, I'm more of a fan of Harry S. Truman than I ever was of Eisenhower, but that's because Harry S. Truman was a Missouri boy, and so there's a little bit of there. You gotta know your roots, know your boys. Um, but it's thinking about it like,
Sadly, all I have to talk about is Woodrow Wilson, and we
oh
don't talk about anything else.
no, I'm so sorry, Woodrow Wilson.
Actually, I don't even know that. I might have more Jersey presidents, but I only know of Woodrow Wilson. I'll put it that way.
I'm so glad Chris Christie never became president. I would have hated that.
Yeah, I could tell you as somebody who was around when he was here. Chris Christie was thought of in the area. There was great hope for Chris Christie. There was I'm trying to think of how to put it. There was of a lot of yeah. I mean, I guess that's just the best way to put it. A lot of hope surrounding Christie. He was going to be the Trump of his day, and he is one of the most disappointing politicians I have ever seen. By the end of his governorship here, he was widely hated by all and sundry, and he seemed to know it and not care, which actually led to a sort of Chad energy. Like, I don't know if this is like New Jersey politics, so I don't know if you remember Bridgegate at all.
Not particularly.
So Bridgegate was this thing where he basically backed up the turnpike, and I say like he basically did, and I'm probably being unfair wording it in that way, but that's what it seemed like at the time.
Hmm.
There was some sort of scandal going on with the tolls that Christie wasn't taking, and like it seemed pretty likely that he at least knew about what was going on. It caused massive traffic jams. There was also this incredible Chad moment where he was photographed on a beach that he shut down with his family. And on one hand, no, yeah, that's risible and incredibly immoral. And he absolutely deserved all of the backlash he got for that. On
Right.
the other hand, there is some Chad energy to doing that. Like, you know what? Everybody hates me anyway. Let's go to the beach.
Right. My polls aren't going to get any better.
Exactly.
But
Then he somehow tried to leverage that into a presidential campaign, and much like Chris Cuomo in New York, where you go like, Cuomo's popular in New York, you go, yeah, but you don't understand. Everybody who's not from that area hates him.
right.
Christie was almost the opposite. Everybody was like, huh, Chris Christie was a Republican who was elected in New Jersey, but then all of the people from New Jersey absolutely hated Christie.
I didn't know all
Yeah,
that. I didn't know all that about his past, but I'm amused by it. It's just the idea of it, that it's like, you never know a man until he's governor of your state. Though I will say that
yeah,
Missouri tends
sad
to.
story though.
Yeah, I don't think we've had an interesting governor's after that guy who tried to sell Missouri to the Confederacy. Uh, took
I
this.
mean, to be honest, Christie was not an Indian governor, which was the disappointing thing about him. We wanted him to be different, and he wasn't. It became immediately clear that he was part of the Uniparty.
Yeah, part of the
Uh,
Uniparty. I've been reading some interesting stuff about how it's always kind of like the same Uniparty. You know what I mean? Like at no point does it ever stop being a Uniparty. There's always seemed to be a Uniparty in control of Carthage, in control of Rome, in control of XYZ, England at times,
well,
other
Fox
places.
Day has been very open about this.
Yep, yep. But I've been seeing it in other people's writing as well. Like just the idea that, yeah, there's always like Satan's party running around doing things, trying to take over um, areas, or just like being evil, sacrificing their children to Moloch for more or less no reason. And it's just very tiresome sometimes with these people. Because in the end, they don't win, really. People come back and they get angry. Or there's all kinds of stuff and they're hoisted by their own petards. As what happened in like places like the French Revolution. Which I do view as like the quote unquote evil party, getting their just desserts by another evil party they helped ferment. Um, the same with like communists, like Trotsky getting the axe to the back, pickaxe or whatever it is to the back of the head. Or was it an ice pick? I think it was an ice pick. He got an ice pick to the back of the head. These great men and not living lives like Columbus, but instead, like just living these generic, boring little things. They do their little thing. They search for their ideals, and then all of a sudden they're kicked out or murdered, or what have you. Like people talk about how when there's a revolution, the revolutionaries aren't necessarily the same people who get into power or whatever. Like they're replaced, they're removed, they're they're no longer a part of the party that brought them in. But at the same time, it's just very, I don't know what to say about it. Like it's like you feel it, right? You feel it, you can describe it, but the philosophy of it, like it's the same thread. It shows up differently depending on the culture and station it's in. If it wasn't, child sacrificing Moloch worshippers, it's emperors who prefer to be a gladiator than to be an emperor, or it's uh, men who waste and corrupt things, or who become free men from being slaves, and they become worse than their masters ever were. Like it doesn't matter like what it is. It's this prevailing cruelty when they don't have to be cruel. It's this hatred when they don't have to hate. Columbus coming back and hating the Indians because these men who he's risked his life to do something worth talking about forever, and then you know he's the villain forever. In when the revisionist historians come in, it's very it's got some sadness to it. It's got a bit of like Satan intended this to be, and so because of it, now his legacy gets tainted. Whereas in reality, it should have been a very heroic legacy. It should have been something that really lasted the test of time. And instead of being something derided by the charlatans of our generation, he should have still been held up as an example of a man who overcame great difficulties. And even if he kind of tripped up at the end, it wasn't the evil that people want to make it out to be. I think about that because it's with the stuff that we're experiencing now, we don't know, we don't have any good role models. Like the role model is Trump or something like that, who allowed himself to be more or less removed from office. And even if there is some sort of like weird plan or whatever like that, he was still very much hampered by the people that surrounded him and by the choices that he made. We're not blaming him for being a philanderer earlier in his life or whatever. From many accounts, he became a Christian. And or at least lived like a Christian in his currently going twilight years. But it's just how do I want to put it? Like it's not as inspiring as it could be. You think about Columbus going through all kinds of hardship, having this crew that he did all kinds of crazy stuff for, and made sure could um, made sure could, survive the thing, and then there's the tragedy of them dying. What's going on? What? All kinds of hardship. Anthony, what's going on? It doesn't inspire, and I want inspiration. Like, there's no point in modeling myself after somebody, whose life goal isn't to being this inspiring thing. It's oh, I did this and that and I made so much money, but it's like Crassus, uh, there's a song that Horrible Histories did. I'm Marcus Licinius Crassus. My riches can never surpass us. It's a very dumb song. Uh, and it's like, yeah, sure, there's certain amounts of inspiring to his life, but how did he really make his money? Well, he probably had a hand in burning down the houses too, but he bought people's houses at a discount while they were burning down. Uh, that's not a Christian moral. Of course, there's a lot of things that are worthy of emulation. His cleverness, his ability to work with people, and so on and so forth. But there's also a lot of just stuff that's ugly, and he died pretty stupid. Supposedly he had gold poured on him because even the Parthians knew how greedy he was. And at the same time, we lost some. Was Anthony, please? I'm muting you, Anthony. I'm sorry. Coming from. I don't have it open. Anthony, are you there? Can you hear me? Hold on, guys. I'm sorry. We're getting some audio issues. Alright, well, I've dropped a line with him. I am going to mute him until he gets it together. No offense to you, Anthony. Unless I am actually the one having problems. No, wait, it's not registering my voice. But it was working 5 seconds ago. Voice activity, mic check. Test. Alright. Alright. Anthony, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I left for a moment and muted my mic, and when I came back, I could not hear you at all through Discord. If you were coming through on YouTube,
Yeah,
I couldn't hear you through Discord, so I don't get it.
yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. I haven't been doing anything, so that's just whatever. Alright, sorry about that, guys. You can hear me through YouTube. Yeah, alright. Anyway, so, okay, I was talking about how to emulate men of the past and comparing them to our current times. Like, what can you say about a character like I don't want to use Trump again, so I'm going to use Buckley, William F. Buckley. So we look at him, and we, in our hindsight, know that he was controlled opposition. He was designed to make a huge generation of controlled opposition, and in general, to just confuse the issue, cause the issue to disintegrate away from solutions and into failures. You know, supposedly he was a great writer. I never really thought much of him. The few times I did read his writing, supposedly he was this, supposedly he was that. But we look at it and we look at the ideals of like someone like Hannibal or Crassus or Julius Caesar, or well, like even the first triumvirate, the second triumvirate. All these men had different ideas, different ideals, and they lived for them up into their deaths. But a man who was designed, not even like Cicero, who more or less tongue lashed everyone who came by him, who he didn't like until he died of it. And by that I mean he was murdered for it. And then we compare it, to these men we've got around us today. It's quite almost disgusting. I can't use the language I want to use on a live stream, but it's like these people are bundles of wood compared to some real men of the past, even though the Roman senators were just as corrupt, were just as self-serving, were just as evil. It didn't matter. It's not about that. It's about having the ability to stab Julius Caesar in the Senate in front of everyone, and then make his nephew do the funeral oration that praises you for it. Like it's that kind of spirit. Do you have the spirit to cross the Rubicon? Do you have the spirit to uh, you know how do I want to put it? Spirit to stab Caesar in the back. Do you have the spirit to be a Gracchi brother? Trump was a Gracchi brother. He tried to do a bunch of stuff and it failed, and he's not coming back to power. Or it's guys like, that get propped up as being, the next Republican.
You crashed for a second, but you came back immediately. Well, I tend to have a lower opinion of Trump, I think, than a lot of the right wing. I mean, it's not like suicidally low or anything, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think that Trump was, I don't think he was actually opposition. I don't think he was a terrible person. I don't think he was an idiot. However, I also don't think he was ever going to be what we needed him to be. I think he was an incredibly selfish and incredibly ambitious man who wanted to be remembered as a great person, but who clearly was not smart enough or good enough to actually go through with what needed to be done in order to do that. And that's it. He is what he is. Like, you can be mad about it, but to be honest, it's absolutely true that he probably did more than literally anybody else alive was capable of doing, and that's true. And I'm not going to be mad at him about that. He wasn't the guy. He was never going to be the guy. I mean, Donald Trump was an extraordinarily selfish man, I think. He was not he was in it for personal glory. He was in it so that he wanted one day monuments to be made to him. There is a non-zero chance. Uh that Donald Trump is elected again, though I find that highly unlikely because they have proven that they can and will engage in widespread fraud. But who knows? You know, honestly, who knows? And if he is, then maybe he'll do enough to prove me wrong. But I am of the opinion that we were in the situation where the only chance that we had to turn anything around was that we needed to get a Cincinnatus. And Donald Trump was never a Cincinnatus. He was never in it for the Republic. He was not in it to save the Republic. He was in it to make his name. And that was never going to be what we needed. That's why he couldn't cross the Rubicon, because crossing the Rubicon would have put him at great personal risk that he did not want to take. And that is entirely understandable. That is how a normal person would react to the risk that they were under. But we needed a man who was willing to cross the Rubicon. There's also the point, there's something that we need to remember too, that greatness as we define it and greatness as God defines it are not necessarily the same thing and do not necessarily mean the same thing. One of the most popular saints of the modern era, with good reason, is Saint Therese of Lisieux. So I doubt you have heard of her. Maybe just in passing, because I might have mentioned her once or twice. But Saint Therese of Lisieux is notable for a few different reasons. She is a doctor of the church, meaning that her writings are considered to be wise and beneficial and fruitful, and they are. They're quite fascinating. But she died, I believe, in her early 20s. Let me look up, Google this quickly. Therese of Lisieux. She died in her early 20s. She was sickly for most of her life, and she died as a nun. Yeah, age 24, I'm correct. So she died at the age of 24 as a discalced Carmelite nun. So she was a nun. She wore the habit and all of that stuff. She was sickly for the majority of her life. She did not really leave her monastery or her hometown. She did very little travel. And yet, she is one of the most popular saints of the 21st century. So, why? What is it about her that is considered saintly when she really didn't do anything from a worldly perspective? And that is exactly right. She did not. From the perspective of the world, Saint Therese of Lisieux lived an incredibly unambitious, uninteresting, noteworthy life. And yet she has gotten praise not only from the Catholic Church, but from many, many, many other different people who have talked about her. Actors, writers, uh, I just saw somebody famous who I thought you would know, but now I'm missing the name again. Oh well, doesn't matter. There are plays about her, movies about her. Her writings are some of the most popular spiritual writings ever written. Like, Saint Therese of Lisieux is not a great person in the same way that Columbus is great, but in other ways she is immeasurably greater than Columbus ever was or ever could be, because Saint Therese of Lisieux was a woman who gave herself in all ways totally and completely to God. She suffered a dark night of the soul because partially because of her extremely painful and horrible illness, and wrote about it and dedicated all of her suffering to God, and because of that great suffering, she is now one of the greatest saints. Her last words were, "My God, I love you." She was incredibly devoted to the Eucharist, uh, and her writings are inspirational to millions and millions of people throughout the world. So, in that sense, I think it's important to remember that what we are called to do by God may not be to be great men. It may be to suffer in silence in ways that we don't understand fully how it will affect people, but that ultimately is for the glory of God. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think that we're conspicuously missing is that there are no obvious, like, saints of the 21st century, great men in the sense of the great men that we've had in the past. What is our modern equivalent of Joan of Arc? Do we have one? I don't think so. It's hard to even imagine one arising, to be honest. Can you imagine a woman or a man, for that matter, going into the government and claiming that they need to take control because God has called them there, and being listened to and given control and turning around the course of a war? Because I can't. There. I feel like we need a saint of the 21st century, and not that there aren't great men and candidates like Maximilian Kolbe, who sacrificed himself in a Nazi death camp to save the life of a man with a family, and that man ended up becoming essentially a Christian missionary as a result of Maximilian Kolbe's sacrifice and lived to his 90s. Uh, there are various options in terms of, like, are there still good or even great men who are out there nowadays? Well, great, maybe not in the sense of great as, men who will change the course of history. I mean, there's people like Putin and Xi Jinping. I still can't bring myself to agree with Vox Day's take on China. I do not think that Xi Jinping is nearly as great of a leader as he seems to think that he is. Uh, It's something that I understand where Vox's perspective on it comes from, and I would compare any leader in the West necessarily outside of arguably Putin to him, but I don't think that China is on quite the upward curve that Vox Day seems to think they're on, especially because a lot of the sources he's getting from them are Chinese sources that are talking about themselves. So, what are they going to say? Uh, with that said, with that said, when you're comparing it to the West, everything looks good. The flip side though is that like religion is still illegal, and so where are they going with this? Like, I can't see, like, where is China going with this? I don't really see an end game for them that's positive right now. That said, are they going to take over Taiwan this year? Probably. In fact, I would be surprised if they didn't. I would genuinely be surprised if they did not make a move to take Taiwan by the end of the year. And also, I would not only say that we're not going to do anything, I would argue that that would be the correct move. Point. This is the point that we've kind of been making all along, right? Like, would it be right for them to take over Taiwan? Well, no, it clearly would not be. But also, it's not our job. Like, it's not our job to protect Taiwan.
Yep.
Taiwan is not a Christian nation. They did not ask us, they're asking us for help, but they are not a people who we have a responsibility to protect, and we're stretched thin enough as it is.
Right. It's somebody was I think it was Sargon of Akkad was talking about academic agents video on Zoomers are Coomers and a few other things like that. And the video was right in many ways, but Sargon makes a point that I think he made it better than academic agent did, and that's like, listen, guys, if our society wasn't collapsed, this would just be some sort of like thing that would be forgotten in a day. Like this wouldn't be a big issue. You
True. By the way, did you notice that John C. Wright has quoted academic agent?
I didn't. I didn't. What?
His most recent article is academic agent on BLM anti-vaxxers.
Oh. Oh my. Well, I'll have to read that article. Uh, yeah, I've been following Academic Agent recently, but but we knew that already. With thinking about that stuff, like when when Sulla came through Rome, I could make an argument that Rome, while it was more robust than our society, because it did produce men like Pompey and Caesar and stuff like that, you know, it wasn't. It was a collapsed society for Rome, and even I was recently watching Dova rewatch Augustus video. Augustus, even at the beginning of the height of the Roman Empire, even in its inception, he would look over and people would complain about, there'd be women whoring it out in the streets and stuff like that. Tiberius, or was it Claudius? I think it might have been Claudius actually. Had a wife who was explicitly, you know, the most libertine woman you can imagine, and did not care. Eventually, she was killed for it, rightly so. And of course, that could have been a historian's sour grapes. But if you think about these things, like there's always an element of collapse before the stuff troubles began, and the hard men will create good times, and we're coming into a time that'll create hard men. I suppose we have no, not I suppose. We do have a responsibility to make sure that the Zoomers realize that cooming is bad. that they're, have responsibilities that were not given to them by their parents, but they must take up if their society should survive them. Or maybe the generation after them or the generation after them, who knows. But considering this stuff, that we're arguing about, in the sense of academic agent, we're arguing about whether or not abs are homoerotic, no matter whose abs they are. That it makes you the woman to like abs. That's missing the point. The point is that, are you being a coomer, or are you being a real person, a real man, having spirit in you? Are you acting to the greatness by which you can reach? For myself, I can say no. And it hurts to say no. It's annoying to say no. I feel like a bundle of sticks. It's bad. And these people who experience these things are just bad. But I wonder about, like, the children of Columbus or whatever, or the people who were in the 1600s rather than the.
Well, Columbus's second child wrote a biography of Columbus.
Yeah. And what did he
Yes.
say? What did he feel?
He admired Columbus.
I dig
He
it.
felt positively towards him. He does write of the Spanish quite brutally. He says that the Spanish treated the natives with a lot of brutality, which is true.
Yeah. But it's like,
Again, that's absolutely correct.
but to be known for writing your father's biography.
Well, such is the fate of Christopher Tolkien, isn't it?
That's true. That's true. There's a certain thing, because it's like, but the biography was, J.R.R. Tolkien. Oh, it was Christopher Columbus. But it's still, it's still something it's got this weird pang of something to it. I'm sadness, melancholy.
Yeah, there's also the tragedy that Christopher Tolkien was not a believer, which is honestly rather shocking to me.
That is very shocking. Because it's like, I would think he would at least be nominally Catholic. Considering his father.
No, the last I read of him, he was not a believer.
Huh.
He did hate the Peter Jackson films, though, so there's that.
I'll admit, I have a kindlier view of the Peter Jackson films than everyone else, it seems. But I never.
I'll tell you, there are two things I disagree about with John C. Wright on his common commentary on the films, because he talks about them fairly often, and he makes two comments that I disagree with. The first is that I strongly disagree that Viggo Mortensen was miscast as Aragorn. He was a perfect casting choice.
Yes.
To the point where I'm actually shocked that anybody would argue otherwise. John argues that he is too effeminate, which I find absolutely baffling. Like, I don't even understand how somebody could think that. Like, it doesn't fit. There's a disconnect in my head when I hear it.
I absolutely. Is he licking the abs? Did he lick Arwen's abs? Is that what happened? Did Percy? I almost call him Percy.
So that I disagree with, and I strongly disagree that the scouring of the Shire should have been in the movie. They were completely correct to cut it out. It was fine in the book. It needed to be there thematically. It did not fit at all cinematically.
Yeah.
Every other criticism that John has made, I agree with. Those two, I strongly disagree with. It simply did not fit pacing-wise in The Lord of the Rings, The Scouring of the Shire. There were already, the Return of the King is already laughed at for having, 5 different endings.
Yes.
Adding another would have been just silly. And Viggo Mortensen was a 100% perfect casting choice. Granted, the writing around Aragorn was flawed. The casting of Aragorn was not.
I guess I never saw it when I was watching it as a kid. So, like, it's one of those things that just kind of comes as a surprise for me. Um,
Well, it's the difference between, it's similar to what they did to Peter in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie, which, by the way, was a movie that I quite, the Walden Media version,
yes.
which, by the way, was a movie that I actually quite liked. But Jaji pointed out that they messed with the character of Peter, which I had never noticed. But after she pointed it out and I compared the movie version to the book version, I had to agree with her. She was absolutely correct. And it's the same essential change that they made to Aragorn, which is a very modern change. They made Peter a reluctant hero.
Ah,
And it's the exact same thing that they did to Aragorn. They turned Aragorn into a reluctant hero. But in actuality, in both books, the heroes were very far from reluctant. In
right.
fact, they were very much prepared and willing to take over control and power as soon as it was offered to them. Aragorn had been preparing for it for decades. He was just waiting for the right moment.
Yeah, I can
And
see.
Peter in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, uh, of course, is, you know, shown to be very reluctant in the movie, but in the book, when Aslan says you're going to be king, he's like, okay.
Yeah,
Because in the modern day, we don't understand the idea of just accepting your, mystical vocation.
right. When when the Jesus allegory line tells you your fate, and you're like, nah, no, thank you.
Yeah, right? And I actually, by the way, I still like that movie. I think that overall, pretty good movie. And to be honest, that's the only real issue that I had with it. The rest of the movie is quite good. Not like the Prince Caspian debacle, which was The Last Jedi before The Last Jedi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just get
Man, one
depressed
day I'm
about
gonna
that one.
have to like, one day I'm gonna have to write something on it because like there are just so many issues with that movie. It's so bad.
You can make it a video, Anthony. You can make it a video, and we could put it up here. It'd be no problem.
It would be like one of those, long man baller videos.
Yes. Okay. Fine. I approve it. You can do it. I will absolutely let you do it. No problems.
That's actually not true. Because there's Long Man and then there's the Long Man, and the Long Man has 10-hour videos, and this would probably be like an hour.
I can set this up for you so that you can talk for an hour. No problem. 10 hours, 11 hours. Spend an entire day talking about it. But your script still has to be on time. But
Always.
always.
That's the real, like, that is unironically the real reason I make any of this stuff. Because whenever I think of doing it, I go, but don't you have a script to get done? And they go, yes, I do.
Yes. But you could, Anthony. I believe in you. I believe in you like Aragorn believed in you, and like Christopher Columbus believed in. Anyway, I do admire the
Yeah.
spirit. I do. Like I genuinely wish I could have a spirit like that, but it's just not the same in me. And it's like you just kind of have to live with what the good Lord gave you, and that's a good thing in and of itself. Um, we're stuck in the times we're stuck in, and I would not be Ben Wheeler if I was in some sort of other time, just like you wouldn't be Anthony Marchetta. Me living the life of a Catholic wheel maker in 17th century Scotland, or well, no, technically I was an American in the 17th century. Um, 1300, Henderson or whatever.
Ben, this is something that did not happen. You could be whatever you want to be.
What? Yes.
This is all something that did not actually happen. You could be wherever you want to be.
What do you mean? The voices in my head tell me it did happen. Come on, Anthony.
So,
No, but here's
look,
the thing.
in my past
No.
life, no, I'm just kidding. We're Christians. We don't believe in past
Right.
lives. That's silly.
But the thing is,
We believe in eternal life after death, which is far less silly.
exactly, eternal life, absolutely, never ending. I find the weird finite soul thing to be a
I
weird
say,
thing.
like, I say that poking fun at Christians, of which I obviously am one, but it is true, and it's something worth talking about, I think, as well. John C. Wright has mentioned something like this. He once had a post up where he said, "People have asked me why I hated Christians." And he goes, and when I was an atheist, he goes, "So I'm going to give you an explanation here." He goes, "Imagine you lived in a world where it seemed like everybody around you had absolute belief in the great Santa Claus religion, and said that Santa, who was a real person, used magic to deliver presents on Christmas Eve every year. But not only did they believe this, it was actionable, and people lived their lives based on it. They made decisions based on it. There were long treatises written on how exactly Santa used his magic to get around. And then you're standing there saying things like, but this makes no sense for extremely obvious reasons, and also you have no proof of it. But still, laws were being made based on the Santa religion. So in the comment, and he explains all this, in the comment, somebody asked him, "So what made you change your mind?" And he says, "Well, because Santa mugged me one day and showed me his magical sleigh and his sack of gifts and explained to me exactly how the magic worked. So it became quite ridiculous for me to deny that all of it was real." And I think there is something to the idea, like, let's not forget that Christianity is a religion of incredible things.
Yes.
And when we talk about, like which is one of the reasons, like, I hear, religious experiences of past lives and things like that. And while I don't believe it, I don't dismiss it out of hand with, that's ridiculous or silly or, you know,
Yeah.
I dismiss it with, this is theologically inappropriate for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And I also wonder if there are other ways we could question how they got such information. Also, like John C. Wright, in terms of things like the fairy world, and the unseen world, I
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily disbelieve in it so much as I am as agnostic towards it. Uh, One interesting thing about my own life is that I have had absolutely no religious experiences whatsoever. I have never heard the voice of God. I have never had an experience that God was near me or has been or was present in my life. I have never experienced God or any sort of religious phenomena in any way. But I am still a believer.
Oh, absolutely.
As a result of this, because I am willing to believe in a supernatural world that I myself have not seen, I am not willing to dismiss out of hand the existence of a in-between world of fairies and things like that, just because I myself have not seen it. It would be the height of hypocrisy if I did,
Absolutely.
to dismiss one and not but not the other. I am agnostic towards it.
I'm actually scared. I had to mow over a fairy circle earlier, and I'm like, oh no. Oh no.
Be careful.
No, I prayed
Uh,
over it, so don't you worry. But yeah,
Terrifying.
you're absolutely right. You're right. And I wasn't talking like an experience that I had or anything like that. I'm just talking about, how people sort of like how things could be different with just little changes, and that I'm not.
I'm disappointed we have no chat today because I thought this was a pretty decent discussion, but we've got nothing today.
No, that's fine.
It's very weird.
I said hi to Bradford.
Bradford was here earlier.
Bradford was here, and we love him for it. I made him a mod, even though we don't really need mods right now, but just in case. Uh, yeah, thinking about this stuff, these great men of the past and stuff like that. I don't mean it in the sense of some sort of like negativity that we cannot achieve great things. No, we can achieve great things. We're going to achieve great things, but they're not going to be the same great things that like Christopher Columbus did or something like that, just because of how different the times and cultures are, and we're not 15th century Italians working for the Spanish crown after their war of annihilation, mutual war of trying to annihilate the Muslims who tried to annihilate them some years ago. It's all different. Just because we're in these times, maybe there were Romans who complained about their governors and so on in the same way we're complaining about them now. And they had plenty of cause to, complain about their governors, especially as things got worse and so on and so forth. And the crisis is built up, and there were emperors like Honorius and stuff like that. And even though he was really made to be what he was, there's still all this, negativity that he could have done something about, even at the cost of his life, that he didn't do. And I do consider that quite a bit. That, do you want to lose your job? Do you want to do this or do that? Or do you want to experience hardship and pain and so on and so forth? And my answer is that, yes, because it's worth it. I went to the gym today. I didn't do all my exercises, but I did about 80% of them. It's like, I went to the gym not because I wanted to live an easy life. I did it to experience the pain and get my body stronger. To lose 30 more pounds from the 30 pounds I've already lost this year, to not be some fat layabout. Because I can't exactly, say something like, all my heroes are dead, there is no choice but to be one, without actively trying to live a heroic life. Not to be swamped by, oh, I need a job, I need to get this or that, I need to experience that.
Oh no.
But
I'll say this on air, but with no viewers. Me, you, and Ken are in an interesting position. We are all single young men right now with no real romantic prospects. And yet, we are also all Christians, and we're all kind of, I guess the word would be based. We're based enough to realize that focusing on the fact that we have no romantic prospects is the path to insanity and to ultimately loneliness.
Wait, what's the path?
Honestly,
The fact that we don't have romantic prospects?
if we focus on that. So, what I'm trying to say is we're all self-aware enough to realize that we are alone. We don't have romantic prospects. But also, if we focus on the fact that we don't have romantic prospects, that will just make things worse. Not to mention, it is unhealthy. So, we're stuck in this in-the-middle state. If you want to talk about the sad state of men right now, it's something that I think all three of us would agree we're really not very interested in talking about, even though we could probably give some insight onto it. At the same time, if we were to give our insight onto it, that would also feed into the cycle of why we're alone. So we're stuck in a catch-22. Does that make sense, or am I confusing you?
See, here's the thing. I know why I'm alone, and why I have experienced loneliness throughout my life. And maybe sometime
So do I.
I'll put it down to a stream or something like that. We can whine about our childhoods or something. I don't know.
Oh no, I'm not doing that.
Good. Because I'm going to. No, I'm kidding. But so it's like
Yeah,
I
I'm
understand.
gonna tell everybody right now, I will never, ever do that.
The reason, so, and I'll talk about it in sort of like the philosophical terms. I could not attract a mate earlier than now, because I was severely dissatisfied with my life, my past, and I had all kinds of issues that I could not deal with because I could not even name what my issues were. You know, it's not about the some sort of like issue farm or my pain's worse than your pain or anything like that. It's that I was incapable of handling it, and the good Lord kept me away from people who would become codependent on me about it, which is the important thing. I've come out of some things that have killed people I grew up with, and I mean that in a metaphorical and literal term. So it's like I've already survived the worst. Okay, this, that, or the other thing. It doesn't matter. It's about getting up and trying again. If the greatness of Gen Y is that, those good Gen Y guys didn't succumb to the times, didn't become Coomers, didn't become buried under a Funko Pop accident and suffocate under a Last of Us 2 Funko Pop. If the greatest of us, actually built something that lasted beyond their generation, that's a crown considering what we grew up with. When I talk about stuff like all my heroes are dead or that I would be a different person under a different time, I'm not talking about in despair. I am not in despair about my times. I understand that, like Sargon said, like Academic Agent probably would say, that we are in the collapse. We're in the moral and philosophical part of the collapse, but we see Rome burning. We experience it. We can sort of live our lives through it, and the goal isn't to be some sort of psychopath taking what you can. The goal is to, really push for something that's worthwhile. I do this not, and I do Pinkerton's Ghost not because I'm gonna make money off of it. I want to make money off of it. I wish to monetize it, but I do it because I understand that it's more important to do it and to have these voices out there. I'm going to write books about stuff. I'm going to write books about history. I'm going to write fiction books. I'm going to take care of this and that. I'm going to take care of my friends if I can take care of them. I'm going to be a great man, not because of the times I live in, but in spite of them. If I, who experienced the great chain breaking within my own family, can do that, there's hope for you too. Bradford Walker says, for my part, I accepted that maybe marriage isn't what I am called for in this life, and instead I ought to focus on the mission. No one sensible says that celebrates wasting?
Celibates.
Celibates, excuse me. You're absolutely right, that is celibates. No one sensible says that celibates wasted their lives. Well, incels waste their lives, specifically. But like...
Well, how are you defining incel? Are you just defining it by the basic term as involuntarily celibate?
Yes.
Or are you using it for, a more broader definition?
Involuntarily celibate, as in could not get sex even if they had the opportunity to try for it.
I mean, in that case, then...
Bradford is no incel, is what I'm saying.
Yes. But on the other hand, quite a lot of people, myself included, are. Who I don't think are bad people.
Anthony, there are plenty of Catholic fillies out there that you will meet, and they will be running in a field, or something like that, or they'll be...
I say this, by the way, with absolutely no, self-pity. I'm just pointing out the fact.
Yeah, sure. And I'm, and I have to deal with self-pity, but it's like one of those things. It's like, okay, yeah, I've got a self-pitying character flaw. I got to deal with that, and the goal is to not be consumed by your problems or your flaws or whatever. Like most people...
I like to think that I'm aware of what my own character flaws are, and I also lament the fact that doesn't seem to help me very much.
It doesn't. It really doesn't. Speaking from experience.
I know exactly what my problems are. I still haven't solved them.
It's like, congratulations, we have the tools to define our psychological problems. Does it help? No. You want some pills? No.
No, definitely not.
No, I'm good. So, let's move away from this thing. I don't think Christopher Columbus was much of a self-pityer. I don't think he went, oh, woe is me, I'm never finding, Atlantis or whatever at this point. And I would say that great men aren't self-pitiers at all. I am going through my journey to avoid self-pity, to avoid being all sorts of horrible things and less of a man. And I want, even if I won't do anything that'll put me up on the same pinnacles that Julius Caesar and Hannibal and Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee and George Washington and all these other great men, truly great men, who have lives worth studying about, worth emulating, and so on and so forth can do, I can at least have God say when I am in, walking into heaven or whatever, or maybe I'm wrong about purgatory and I got to go through that first, or, any number of other things, and it's like, well done, good and faithful servant. you overcame the world, you overcame the things that were dragging you and your generation down. And I think that's the ultimate calling for all men of all times, of all generations, great or small.
Well, I would postulate this. Our ultimate calling of all men of all times is to become saints.
Yes. We are speaking of the
So,
same thing.
yes, we are saying the same thing in different ways. So,
Catholic.
the one thing, the only uh, caveat I suppose I would add on to all of this is the same one that I made earlier. What you think might make you a great man and what God is calling you to do are not always going to be the same thing.
Yep.
What God values and what man values are different. The crucifixion is the ultimate example of this. The notable thing about the crucifixion was not just that it was an execution, it was a shameful execution. The execution that slaves had. It is something Christ was often referred to as Christus by the Romans because Christus was a term that they would use for slaves, because Christ died a shameful and utterly disreputable and I'm trying to think of the word exactly, humiliating death.
Yep.
A death that, if anybody but the Son of God underwent it, would amount to nothing. But of course, that death was changed, and the cross was changed, because the man who died that death was not just a man, but also God, and he came back and defeated the cross.
Yeah.
Sometimes what is happening to us, we are looking at day 1 or day 2 of the 3 days before the resurrection.
Hmm.
The important point is that we are following the will of God the best that we think of it. And sometimes, we mentioned this before when we were talking about Trumpton, or, our American term for it. Sometimes it's really about the cathedral plan, right?
Right.
Building those things into place, knowing that we're not going to live to see the result, but trusting in our faith that we are doing the will of God and that God will bring things to good.
You're absolutely right.
So, what was Columbus ultimately, now that we are at the end of the stream? Columbus was a complicated man. He was probably a man who, I would posit at least, that he was a man of God who had been chosen by God to spread Christianity, but who ultimately was a sinful man and succumbed to those sins. And now it is, in a sense, even though the people who have redefined his legacy are doing it because they are dishonest and they hate Western civilization, in another sense, it is only right that that this is becoming Columbus's legacy.
Yep.
And yet, I feel that he should be remembered mostly like Solomon or David, a horrendously flawed individual who ultimately was what God needed to bring Christianity to the New World at the time, despite what he became.
Hmm. Yep. And thinking about it, Protestant or Catholic, there's still many missions that are uh, going forward at great sacrifice and meeting great success. The man who killed and ate Jim Elliot and Nate Saint became Christians. And that is from a Christian perspective. Because admittedly, thinking back on it, I've taken a very materialist worldview because I have material problems and thus have lost track of what makes, the Christian truly great. Is that service towards God. Am I living my life in that service? We are called to bring the gospel to all nations. Are my writings pointing towards Christ, or are they pointing towards something else? I like to think that they do point towards Christ. Uh, and they certainly will continue for Pinkerton's Ghosts, because they're going to pry the copyright from that from my cold, dead fingers. You heard me, Walt Disney. Uh,
Well, depending on how much money they are. What?
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 After that whole speech.
8 figures? 8 figures? Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Can fund a lot of mission trips.
This could fund a lot of mission trips. Oh, yes, of course. And like the guy like smells straight up of sulfur. Oh, yes, you can do many good things with this money. It won't ruin your
Give that
life.
money to the poor.
Absolutely. And you're poor. It's like, oh my goodness. Uh, there's a reason why taking the ticket ruins people. It separates
So,
them from needing God.
here's the question. If we do take the ticket one day, what would we do to make up for it? Tune in next week to find out.
I guess we are going to talk about this next week. All right.
I don't know. I'm just saying things.
Yeah, okay. Good, because you've been giving me a lot of live stream ideas. In all the best ways.
No, I can hear you. I can hear you. Oh no. Oh no. Ben has lots of things planned on Halloween. Yes, I will be I will be reading a Sherlock Holmes story, The Five Orange Pips. Ken will be reading what's he doing? The Mask of the Red Death.
I think so. Or, no,
Uh,
I think C. J. Grabler is doing that. Then,
C.J. Graveler.
yep, he's a
Yeah,
friend of the
C.J.
show.
Graveler will be reading. Yeah, friend of the show, C.J. Graveler will be reading The Red Death. I will be reading the Sherlock Holmes horror story, The Five Orange Pips. One of my favorite Sherlock Holmes adventures. Ken will be reading some other Edgar Allan Poe work. I believe no, he'll be doing we'll be doing a radio drama version of Cask of Amontillado.
I think Ken is doing The Raven, and he'll start us off with that.
Yes.
And then I've got a few different things coming in, including J.D. Cohen's Y Signal, which is a very good 80
Horror story.
horror
Yes,
story.
I've read it.
Um,
It's excellent.
I'm going to try and get some other people to contribute, but we'll see. Anyway, if you're good, I'm going to end the stream. And I will see you next week.
Adios.